Hello, and welcome to this series of videos which will be covering the biological basis of behavior. We'll begin this unit by focusing on an overview of the human nervous system as well as a brief overview of the endocrine system. In this unit on the biology of behavior, we will be covering the human nervous system, the endocrine system. We'll also, in separate videos, take a look at the parts and functions of the single nerve cell known as a neuron, and we will also look at the parts and the functions of the human brain. And at the end of this unit, you will be able to explain, in very simple terms, the role of biological factors in behavior and cognition. So let's begin by looking at the human nervous system and just its basic units. The human nervous system is divided into two parts. The central nervous system, which, if you think of a stick person figure, would include the brain and the spinal cord, the center of the stick person, and everything out in the periphery, including the smooth muscles and the glands and the skeletal muscles, would be part of what's called the peripheral nervous system. So the two divisions are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system is then further subdivided into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. This diagram from your textbook overviews the human nervous system, and it shows you the individual nerves and neurons that make up both the peripheral nervous system, and you can see them kind of highlighted in yellow here, and you can see how they radiate off of the center into the periphery. Some of them are very large and start at the spinal column and go all the way down to the tips of your fingers or the tops of your toes. Others are very small and kind of stay more localized, but each of them has the same basic structure, the neurons in the nervous system, which we'll take a look at in a separate video. In contrast, the central nervous system, which is highlighted here in blue, is the brain, which we'll focus on separately, and the spinal column. And so we have the central nervous system, and then everything out in the periphery being the peripheral nervous system. And so as we can see, if we follow this flow chart, the peripheral nervous system is then further subdivided into the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls self-regulated functions and internal organs and glands. So the internal organs and glands, the smooth muscle things such as heart rate, the heart muscle, the lung function, and other kind of glands in your body. In contrast, the nerves that make up the somatic nervous system control voluntary movement and help move our skeleton around in space, such as moving our fingers and wiggling our toes and kicking soccer balls, etc. The autonomic nervous system, the part that's controlling smooth muscles and glands, is further then subdivided into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. We'll be focusing more on this as we go along when we talk about emotions and stress-related responses. And when we talk about the fight or flight response, which you may be familiar with that phrase, talking about how our body is activated for action, is actually the arousing or sympathetic division of our nervous system being kicked into action. So the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system is the arousing part that kind of gets our body jazzed up and ready for action. In contrast, there's a compensatory system, the parasympathetic, that tends to kind of help balance out and bring us back down and calm down our nervous system after it's been activated. So we have kind of these two competing systems. One arousing, one is calming. This diagram from your textbook shows in greater detail some of the specific smooth muscle and glandular type responses that are under the control of the autonomic nervous system. So we can see here the sympathetic division of the autonomic system and the parasympathetic division. Over here on the left, these functions are often what we refer to when they kind of all are activated at once as the fight or flight response. So these are functions such as the nerves are triggered that cause our pupils to dilate or get very wide, It causes our heart rate to accelerate, our heart muscle to beat faster. It inhibits digestion. It stimulates the release of glucose from our liver, so we have more energy in the form of this blood sugar to kind of energize our muscles and make us move faster and think quicker. The adrenal glands then start to pump out hormones such as norepinephrine and epinephrine. You can think of adrenaline, that's kind of a similar substance that's coming from your adrenals. In contrast, when the parasympathetic division is activated, our pupils contract, our heart rate slows down, digestion is stimulated, the gallbladder is stimulated, etc. So when we talk about the fight or flight response, these are the actions, and the idea is that mammals have developed this fight or flight response for survival reasons. So what would be the survival advantage that under certain circumstances our pupils dilate, our heart starts to race, our digestion is inhibited, etc.? Well, biologists and evolutionists would believe that these reactions from our body, which are automatic, we don't have to think about them, they kind of automatically, reflexively occur under certain situations. Sometimes they're triggered by real environmental events, such as your car skidding against the ice and kind of going into a small turn or kind of losing control temporarily of an automobile. This fight or flight response would kick in and these kinds of reactions would be observed. But interestingly, sometimes we can think ourselves into anxiety and stress and negativity in such a way that sometimes, even though there's not a real threat to us, sometimes psychologically we can also talk ourselves into situations when we kind of get ourselves into this kind of mini fight or flight response. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about stress and anxiety and emotions later on this semester. But the survival advantage would go back to this idea that humans have evolved so that when we are in dangerous situation, when there is a real threat, having our pupils dilate allows in more light so we can see better, which can facilitate getting away from dangerous situations, for example. When our heart rate accelerates and our digestion is inhibited, we have more resources for important things like running or doing strong activities or defending ourselves, these kind of so-called fight or flight reactions. So this is an overview of the human nervous system, and specifically here looking at the autonomic nervous system and the different functions of this when the sympathetic branch is activated versus when the sympathetic or the parasympathetic is activated. This diagram overviews the second major chemical communication system in the human body, which is the endocrine system. What's important to realize about the endocrine system is here we're talking about glands that release hormones which then circulate to their site of action through the bloodstream. Now that's going to be different than the nervous system, which we'll be talking about in a separate video, where neurochemicals are released from the neurons themselves and then stimulate the action of other neurons in a particular sequence to produce some kind of action. So it's important to keep in mind too that the endocrine system often triggers these glandular responses. So the endocrine system and the nervous system do work together very closely, but we're just kind of looking at them at this point as they're two kind of separate systems, but keep in mind that they do often work together. But these are the particular, some of the important glands, and it talks about some of the hormones that might be released. So for example, the adrenal glands here, which are residing on top of your kidneys, trigger the fight or flight response, in part that because when the adrenal glands are activated as part of the nervous system, they secrete the hormones adrenaline or epinephrine and noradrenaline, which then causes certain kinds of reactions. But it's the endocrine system is glands releasing hormones which then circulate through the bloodstream. So at this point, as just an overview, it's important to have a little bit of practice and see if the basic understanding here is clear to you. And the question that I might pose is, how are you able to listen to and view this video and write down notes on the content of what you're hearing or seeing? How is it that something outside of you, this environmental stimulus or event, somehow gets into your body and then is translated? Somehow this information then turns into you writing down in a notebook or on a piece of paper words like neuron and endocrine system. This diagram is a very simplified way of kind of better understanding the steps that occur to make behavior happen. So the event in this situation, if we kind of start at the beginning of this flow chart, the environmental event is the listening to or the viewing of the video. Environmental events, to be translated eventually into behavior, need to first of all be stimulated by one of the sense organs in the organism. Now the primary sense organs are ones that you're familiar with, which would be the senses of sight, taste, sound, smell, touch, etc. So in this case, the sense organs that are stimulated would be the ears, receiving the auditory stimulation, as well as your eyes, which are receiving visual stimulation. So the information kind of enters our body through one of the sense organs. The sense organs then, by way of the sensory neurons, sometimes also referred to as afferent neurons, send that information to the central nervous system, again, brain and spinal cord, to be processed, and then the central nervous system basically sends that information along the neurons, taking the information to the muscles and glands to produce the behaviors that we are talking about. In this case, writing down a word on a piece of paper. The name of the muscle or the glands, the name of the neurons that transmit information from the central nervous system to the muscle and glands are the motor neurons, sometimes referred to as efferent neurons. What you need to keep in mind is that individual neurons are being activated and communicating in a particular sequence at each step of the way. And so it will take all of this system working together for you to hear my voice or read the words on a PowerPoint slide such as this, and eventually then write something down in your notebook. We'll talk more about the brain, but think of all the incredible things the brain must do with that information. Your brain must realize that I'm speaking a certain language, in this case English. Your brain needs to be able to translate my words into something that you understand and understand the meaning of the words. You need to have the ability to see, and so we do have visual areas in our brain that allows us to perceive this information coming from our eyes, the visual areas of the visual cortex, the occipital lobe in the brain. You also have an area that allows us to hear sound, the auditory cortex, which is part of the temporal lobe. And we'll learn more about the parts of the brain and the connection back to the senses when we get to one of the upcoming videos on biology. So this ends this mini lecture on the communication systems, and in the next video we'll take a look at the individual neurons themselves.